Before Morris introduces our greatly welcome speaker, Lord Owen, just a few words about the Centre for Policy Studies. We're going through one of our purple patches at the moment, I'm delighted to say. Just the other day we had two great successes. One that the Office of Tax Simplification is indicating that they're looking to take forward one of Morris's great ideas on possible abolition of corporation tax for small businesses. Secondly, another campaign which we've been running for a very long time is to get competition on the railways. And just the other day, the Competition and Markets Authority announced that this is now going to be put to the Department of Transport, which will have the responsibility of taking that forward unless they can find some objections. So we will continue fighting on that score. Obviously, this work is only possible due to the fantastic support we have from associates and donors. So do, if you're not already a member, make sure that you sign up when you buy a copy of the book, which is obviously why you are here. Thank you very much indeed. Morris.
Yes, I do. I would like to say a word, if I may. Before I say anything about our esteemed guest of honour, I would like to say, which I don't say enough, that this Centre for Policy Studies is based entirely on the brilliance of the editor and now director, Tim Knox, and Jenny Nicholson, who is here somewhere. Yes, who really truly are the CPS, and I hope you'll join me. So it is, as you all know, it is the policy of the Centre for Policy Studies only to launch books by geniuses, which we are sure are going to be bestsellers, as with Tom Bower, who I saw here earlier. Now this is a very serious piece of work, and it's a great honour for us to present this to you. It contains very strong views on the subject of the day, which is the EU, and David, in his capacity, with which you're all familiar, but as Foreign Secretary, etc. But what you perhaps will not be so familiar with is that in their lordship's house, there is a palpable difference in the sound in the chamber, as some of you will be aware. A palpable difference when certain people speak, in that the House of Lords knows who it wants to listen to. And these are very honoured individuals, one of whom is here. And I'm just going to say, he's going to tell you what he wants to say, but I'm just going to tell you what. I'll take you from the last paragraph here, and he's going to tell us more about what he means by this. He's talking here about the EU, and he says, "It is the weak nerve centre of a flabby semi-state with almost defenceless frontiers whose humanitarian rhetoric masks spinelessness." So, here is Lord Owen.
Well, thank you very much for asking me, and I have said to the press a little bit what was much better said by Boris in the Daily Telegraph today about the ill-advised nature of Obama's visit. Sometimes diplomatic niceties and democratic conventions are worth keeping. We've kept them in this country over many, many presidential visits, and they have never, there's only one exception. I will admit I was tempted to see that President Carter came back on a visit in 1979, but I was quietly reminded by the Foreign Office that there was a precedent which was not absolutely correct about this. When Harold Macmillan met with President Eisenhower in August, September 1959, and promptly called an election on October the 8th. And knowing Jimmy Carter, I knew he was absolutely a protocol-conscious person, and there was no point in pursuing the question. But I do believe that it has an advantage, actually, because I think we can get out on the table some of the nonsense that has been spoken by the United States on this issue for a very long time. Nothing, I may say, is more absurd than my good friend Henry Kissinger's remark, which has always been used as if it's a serious remark. I don't believe he ever meant it seriously, that he wanted one telephone to ring. the one thing that Henry would do is he'd ring one telephone. If he got the answer he wanted, that would be all. But if he got the answer he didn't want, he'd ring around until he did get the answers he wanted. And he would manipulate and arrange the different countries. So I think that it is worth us asking a few questions of President Obama. Firstly, why is it that almost ever since the economic crisis hit, successive Treasury Secretaries from him have been at every single meeting of finance directors, of finance ministers, arguing that you must do something about the Eurozone. And they have, with increasing strength and vigour, demanded that something be done. The fact is that their advice has been ignored, just as the British advice has been ignored. And I think the centrality of the monetary unions on this whole issue cannot be minimized at all. From the moment of Maastricht, we were embarked on a very different common market, European community, European Union. And I say it, but he'll be embarrassed if I say it, but there is one political person, and he happens to be in this room, Nigel Lawson, who has been correct on this issue absolutely all the way through. And some of his memos to Margaret Thatcher in the middle 80s predicting exactly what would happen. And you cannot escape this fact that the Eurozone is a dismal failure, and it has made the EU a dysfunctional grouping of countries. And it does not just affect our economic performance, our lack of growth, and the appalling levels of unemployment. It affects our foreign policy and defence policy. And I will just say a few quick words about that. I think that just as it is absolutely vital for a country to control its currency, I believe it is also vital to control its foreign and defence policy. You cease to be a country if you don't do that. And I think that we all know that we joined NATO, we understood what it's meant over all these years. It's a very serious military alliance. It has kept the United States over here, managed also to have kept Canada over here. And I think it is a hugely precious asset. And I believe the EU is a direct threat to it. And I think it has been getting worse. President Obama has lifted the situation on us. He has told us that he had to tell the Prime Minister that if he didn't contribute 2% of GDP, he'd better stop calling it a special relationship. He's also talked about free riders. We are, all of us, free riders. A situation in which the percentages differ a little, between 73 to 75% of the defense budget being part of the United States is an indictment of us all, and we have to do something about it. Now, we could go along with the pretension of EU foreign policy and EU defence policy, but don't forget that in Maastricht, wording was introduced against the bitter opposition of the then permanent representative in NATO about common defence. Common defence up until that point had always been considered purely and simply a matter for NATO. And slowly and gradually, Chirac and Blair then moved to autonomous decision-making. You only have to talk to the level below the top, the sort of colonels and above in the United States, to know how much they resent the double counting of the EU defence policies. They regret many of the decisions. Now, I'd like to just point out very quickly some of the areas which we are still seeing now at this moment, where EU foreign policy is actually being dangerous. Firstly, take the Ukraine accession agreement with the EU. The wording of that document, and I do deal with it a little bit in this pamphlet, is of an EU of aspiration to replace NATO. And so they have put into this accession agreement wording about defense, which is bound to have been provocative to any recent Russian leader. Gorbachev would have got upset about it, Yeltsin would have got about it. So it's not just a question of Putin. And you have to ask yourself, how did that document ever go through? How did Britain, that had been a signatory to the Budapest Memorandum, which tried to give assurances to Ukraine as they gave back nuclear weapons and missiles, all to the Russian Federation, that their boundaries would be things. We're told about influence. As I understand it, the Prime Minister first heard about the visit of President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel to Minsk on the telephone as they were about to leave. Now, if we are serious about this, that a signatory to the Budapest Memorandum, a country with as much history of all that have been involved with the nuclear arrangements with the Russian Federation in the handover and the transfer, should have been outside that whole negotiation. You don't have to go very much further. And then you look at other areas, this whole Turkey arrangement that has been done. Suddenly we find that the settled view of the European Union for many years has been that Turkey will not be ready to come into the European Union in any circumstances, not least for the commitment to free movement of labour and people, which would be unacceptable in terms of its population, 75 to 80 million. But more than that, it's human rights, it's a whole range of other things. For the last 3 years, I've been trying to persuade people to offer EEA membership to Turkey, which would be, but without free movement, because I think their economy needs help. I think it's a crucially important country. I don't see us ever being able to really grapple with ISIS if Turkey was to leave NATO. And so these EU foreign ministers, under great pressure, far too much pressure, incidentally, from Germany, have signed up, not all of them even yet, but have signed up to this policy, which they are openly telling everybody that they're going to cynically ignore, that there's no prospect of it. Well, what's the effect of that? You give the impression to the Turks that they have got speeded up entry, and in 2 years' time they discover that the whole thing was a farce. I tell you what they'll do. They'll start to leave any concept of Ataturk of being part of Europe as well as the Middle East, and I believe their NATO membership will come under question. There used to be a situation which we boasted about in this country, whether in the city or amongst our politicians, that our word was our bond. For the Prime Minister to sign up to that wholly cynical view of Turkey's membership of NATO will backfire on us with very damaging consequences. And this is the problem. It is pretension. At every level that you look, at EU foreign policy or defence policy, it is pretend. They want a rapid reaction force. Where do those forces come from? They come, though they won't admit it, from NATO's rapid reaction force. Autonomous decision-making in the French is a decision to go and commit to combat without the United States being involved in that decision, and yet using their resources and their forces. Successive defence secretaries, whether they're Republican or Democrat, have warned us that if we go on like this, gradually giving ground to the French over NATO's structural integrity, then we will find that they will not be able to sell back home the spending commitment and the huge effort they put into NATO. So I must tell you quite bluntly, one of my main reasons for believing we should take this opportunity is I think that we should pull out of what I call the soft aspects of EU defence policy and use that money to build up our capacity to be part of harder elements of NATO policy. And also I think we've got to be really very blunt about the nature of foreign policy decision making. It is serious. It is not just gestures. There's going to be a referendum in Holland in a few weeks' time, in early April, forced by a provision to be able to demand a referendum when a very substantial number of people fill in. And it's on the EU-Ukraine agreement. Now, I don't know what's going to happen, but I have a feeling that we'll have that repercussion back here in this country, even if they get close but don't even win. It's very much a sort of private enterprise effort, of course supported by Wilder's party. And then there are other aspects in which we look at this whole foreign policy. So I think it is time we ask the Americans, what do you really want? And perhaps particularly Obama. I think that we've got to start to say to them, this assumption that Britain staying along and going along with the EU is actually allowing NATO to begin to wither on the vine. Maybe there are some people in America who would like that. We've always known there are some. But the vast majority of American people have been hugely supportive of NATO under Republican and Democratic presidents ever since Truman went into reverse, really, in 1946 and decided to stay. It has been the best safeguard, and at the present time, when we look at the world as it really is, I shudder to think what would happen if they were not here. And you've seen this in Georgia, you've seen it over the Crimea, and you've seen it in the worries that the Baltic states have. Now, I'm not, as I say, alarmist. I believe that Britain has still got the capacity to operate diplomatically, economically, and politically worldwide. I've always been a blue-water diplomatist, and I think this offers us a chance. And what is this offer? It's very difficult for David Cameron, it seems, to face up to the fact that he has offered us this choice. No, nobody else has done. He came to us and said there was a choice and it was going to be put to a referendum. Then as soon as the referendum came, we were told there was no choice. Well, there is a choice, and I think the people of this country are ready to take it. And I think the Americans have got to accept that this is a democratic procedure, a democratic choice of our people. It is not a decision to turn away from the world, far from it. It is to break out of this constricted EU, and I may say there's a wider Europe even beyond the EU, to trade worldwide, to re-establish the growth that we think we could be capable of getting. It's better growth than the inside of Europe. And what's the alternative? If we say no, and we say remain, don't think that our protests in future will get the same level of hearing. It will be far, far less than it was. We will have chosen a direction of travel. It will be to acquiesce in the Eurozone, acquiesce in the EU, and we will gradually find those people who used to tell us if we didn't go into the Euro it would be such a disaster, who now tell us we'll never go into the Eurozone. They'll soon be at our door knocking and telling us why we should go into it, because we have no other alternative. And I think the Americans need to know, and Obama needs to face up to the fact we have a choice. And this choice is more in the interests of the United States generally, I think, for Britain to start to take back, if you like, some of the strengths we used to have in foreign policy and defence, which were an essential part of the building of NATO. And this is not romantic retroism. This is not, of course we're in a different situation, but we took too big a peace dividend. Our defence forces are unnaturally weak. We have made some very serious mistakes, as has America, over Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Libya. I'm not sure whether it's really helpful for the Prime Minister to be reminded of the serious failure of foreign policy and defence policy over Libya in President Obama coming back. But then there's another issue which I think we also have to face. Say we decide no. What message will go out in Europe? There might be temporary relief, but I think they will say that we have taken the decision to acquiesce in they becoming a federal union. They may find some way of keeping us on the sidelines of this whole decision, but the idea that our influence will increase in that European Union in this situation as they move more and more to a Eurozone dominated. And we then have to ask ourselves, and what will it mean for our economy, for our living standards, for our employment possibilities, for our growth? I think it will be that we'll be becoming ever more trapped into their low growth, rather protected environment. So I think this is a historic choice. I know when I decided to really come off the fence, in the space of 3 days, I heard Michael Heseltine, John Major, and the Prime Minister all saying that if we left, Scotland would break away. This is a total canard, and we should say so absolutely clearly. No British Prime Minister, I imagine even David Cameron, though it's noticeable he will not say this, because he wants to use this issue in this election. But we said this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You cannot go on having referendums every couple of years. This is absurd. And no Prime Minister will agree to an official referendum, which is what the 2014 was, with full legal binding responsibilities had they voted to separate. And furthermore, we know this, that they can have a referendum, the SNP can call a referendum, the Scottish call it a Scottish, but have no legal binding. It will have absolutely no effect whatever in the EU, that's for sure. We know very well that it will be very difficult for Scotland ever to get into the EU, given the problems of Barcelona and everything like this. But I think, above all, we need to be quite clear about this. We will not be bullied into this. The decision to have a referendum announced by the Prime Minister was in 2013. The Scots knew that this referendum was coming when they voted in 2014. And this is not going to be conceded by any British government, left, right, or centre, unless they're completely crazy. So there will not be a separation. Maybe this issue will come back earlier than some people might like. I don't know. 15 years, maybe, longer, maybe, but it won't be much shorter. And I think we should have the courage to be quite clear to the Scottish people. And it's much easier to do so now with the economic figures, which show absolutely clearly that their economic programme was fraudulent, and that the consequences of the very low oil price are really quite serious. I mean, I've been in the oil industry for the last 20 years, and I can assure you that Aberdeen, fortunately, has got some very high skills and can sell them abroad, but they're more and more doing it abroad and not elsewhere. So I go into this campaign with confidence, with a belief that we have got the elan that we need, and I'm very pleased that Boris is there with Michael Gove, and I think that the two of them have strengths and ability. People like Nigel and I are rather older these days, but Nigel did a great job in establishing Vote Leave and in keeping the... We will contribute as much as we can, but this issue is now going to move to the younger generation. We've got to appeal to them, we've got to make it clear what their future is, and we've got to have the confidence that they will make the right judgment, and I believe they will.
Lord Owen has very kindly said he's going to take some questions. We've got a very big crowd here, and I wonder if I could encourage you to move forward and let the people outside the door come in. Do you want to all come in? And while they're do come in. While they're coming in, can I tell you that the CPS has... Hello all. Come on in. The CPS has sent out a press release this evening, which is a letter from Lord Owen to President Obama.
Sure.
Have I got you all? Thank you very much. The CPS has sent out a press release this evening containing a letter from Lord Owen to President Obama, which I'm sure he will take very carefully. And now, if you'd like to ask Lord Owen a question, would you try and catch my eye, please? I'm sure there'll be many of you. Let's start here.
You didn't say anything about what would happen if we leave the European Union to our economy. Now, access to the market is very important. A huge proportion of our exports go into the European Union. I've looked at the Norwegian and the Swiss situations where they do have access to the market, but they have to follow all the rules without any say in that. Now, is that going to be very damaging to us?
Look, I think what we should do is this. Let's first of all be clear. We are not going to do the negotiating. We are being asked by the Prime Minister to choose the course of direction, EU or not EU. It is for this Conservative government, which has got another 4 years to run. I've never voted for them in my life, I never will, but they've got 5 years experience, and they will have to handle this very difficult negotiation. It's one of the reasons why I think it's a very good time to do it. No general election around the corner, none of the party politics, and they will have to settle down and choose. I think that the Prime Minister made a misstatement when he said in the House that we will immediately, I think he said, immediately apply for Article 50. Firstly, if he's lost this referendum, it's a cabinet decision, and he's going to have to reflect in his cabinet and in the structuring of any negotiation the result of it. And I believe he will do so, and I think he is a patriot, and I believe he will settle down and look at the options objectively. That is one of the options. But to compare our position with Norway, we in our trading position, they trade with us, the EU countries, substantially net. And we're also a very substantial country. The idea that we would be treated... I looked at EEA membership and have been writing about it for the last 3 years. That was what I hoped the Prime Minister would negotiate about, and could have, in my view, found a very reasonable thing, which we would have found that everybody, Norway and others, were voting members, including ourselves, that Turkey wouldn't come in if they were not going to be voting members, and we could have done some deal in the EEA. I think that's off the table now. And I don't actually think the EEA is anywhere near as attractive once you've decided that you're going. And, you know, the game changes. This pamphlet was written when I still hoped the Prime Minister would negotiate a proper deal. But it's certainly one of the options. But I think that there is an opportunity here to break out of the old structures and to immediately feel that you have to go back into the way the single market is developed. I want to look at the other options, all of them. EFTA on its own, if need be, although I think that's not a very good option. WTO, a broad option, which has some advantages, but not as such a, you know, there's so many advantages. I think you can look at all, I don't even rule out NAFTA, incidentally. So I'd like to see the Cabinet look at all these, decide what they want to do, bring forward a decision about Article 50, coinciding with the European Communities Act. Callaghan, in this 1975 referendum, was asked, you know, it'll take a long time. He said, if we lose, we will have to bring the European Communities Act together in a couple of months. And I think we will have to deal with it, maybe only enabling legislation, but it gives us an opportunity to make clear our strategy. So I think it's not our job. They want us to say what our options are. This is Mr. Cameron's choice. And it's the government that are going to take this decision. This isn't unreasonable. We elect them to govern us. They want to stay there for 4 years, and he said he wants to stay on as Prime Minister. It's not my job to choose who you in the Conservative Party choose your Prime Minister either. I'm perfectly happy for it to be done. But once we've made the direction of travel clear in this referendum, then they have to take account of it and look at all those options as objectively and clearly as they can. Do not be defeatist about this. There's a lot of nonsense that's talked about trade arrangements. Trade follows interests, and arrangements are based basically on interest. Initially, I suspect there'll be a good deal of hostility in the European Union, and we might not take. So don't rush into it. But we have one vital thing, and this we must stress. We have 2 years of transition during which nothing need change from the moment we invoke Article 50. That is very helpful, and I believe it's a major reassurance to people outside in the general public who are worried about this issue. You can say to them, it's the government who'll do the negotiating, but one thing you can be sure about, there needs need to be any change for 2 years.
I'm coming over here.
Yes, I seem to recall a time when David Cameron was quite a Eurosceptic, which doesn't appear to be the case anymore. Would you agree with that? Or?
I don't follow David Cameron terribly.
But why is he so pro what a feeble negotiation is actually had?
Well, I think he did have a choice when he came back from this. Look, I have some experience of inadequate negotiations. The 1975 renegotiation, I was in the government, and none of us really pretended that this was a major renegotiation. What the 1975 referendum was about was Callaghan and Wilson saying to the Labour Party, on balance, we think it's best to go into it. Actually, Harold Wilson wanted it more even than Callaghan, and he wanted it quite badly. But he never made the mistake of saying that it was only option. He never used fear. He was perfectly ready to take the judgment of the people and do it. And as I said to you, that example of Callaghan writing to the Cabinet Secretary, actually during the referendum, and saying, you must get on with getting ready to deal with the European Communities Act, shows the genuine nature of that. I think that we've watched a very extraordinary exercise in democratic politics. I do not understand how you can call a referendum, which after all is a sign of weakness. It was in 75. Labour Party was deeply divided. Tory Party this time are deeply divided. These are exactly the same. A renegotiation was built up by Cameron to be very important. He set the date. Why the hell he didn't walk away from this and say, I'll come back to this. I've got as long as December 2017. And I know it's going to take a long time, but this isn't good enough, I'm afraid. I can't sell this. But he got himself into this. I don't understand it. My suspicion is that the British economy is weaker than we think. Now, some people will use this, no doubt, starting on Wednesday, as another reason why we shouldn't go. If that is the truth, and it is weaker than we think, in my view, it becomes even more important that we change direction. Even more. What it will show is that we're much more sucked into this Eurozone decline and this EU dysfunctionality. Some people say, well, because we're not in the Eurozone. I fought passionately with Rodney, who I'm lovely to see here, I must say, in New Europe and with Business for Sterling. We all knew that if the Iraq war had turned out differently, in 2003, Tony Blair would have gone for the Eurozone. We'd have given him a run for his money, but it would have been damned hard to win.
We would have won.
There are signs of optimism. Well, I think we can win again, but I think this is a much better chance and better opportunity. So that's how I think. But I mean, you know, I am not going to, in this campaign, get into discussing. As far as I'm concerned, he's the Prime Minister, he should stay the Prime Minister, he should live up to his commitment, he should be open-minded about the result and follow what it's through and stop all this nonsense. It's nonsense, and I believe the British people know it's nonsense.
Do I see a hand? Professor.
Thank you, Lord Owen, for that wonderful analysis. To the practicalities of leaving and winning the referendum, it seems to me, correct me if you think I'm wrong, that it's the leader of the Labour Party who in fact holds some important cards. Because working class people, many of them will vote UKIP. Most of the Tories will vote to leave. But there is a large segment of the population of the electorate, Labour Party supporters, who will do what Jeremy Corbyn tells them, his leadership. How on earth can we persuade Jeremy Corbyn to be the honest man and do what he believes is right?
Well, Frank Few is here, and he probably better placed than me. We've got Gisela Stewart, Frank, and other people. But I think the answer to your question is, we know, and the Labour Party knows, that the position of Corbyn and McDonnell on the EU is purely and simply done to keep the party together, and that they've got so many fights on their hand, they can't have an EU fight. And I would very much question how strongly they're influenced. But there are things that we can do. One of the important things, which I discovered after I got into Vote Leave, is that we are promising, with the money that we save from things, to do it on certain things. We've said the farmers will be, during the transition period, will not be disadvantaged. The science budget, where they do get more from the EU, will be looked after. But they're also saying they will do something about spending on the health service. That's pretty important. Now, it's going to be a test for some of you in this room. On the question of bringing back powers to Britain, just remember that it goes both ways. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And inside the Labour Party at the moment, there are many people who are very angry about TTIP, which incidentally is not just a trade agreement. If it was, I would agree with it. I've agreed with every trade agreement, free trade agreement. It's also a regulatory agreement. And Pascal Lamy, who knows more about any of this than most of us, says it was very ill-advised to run the two together. Now, within the Labour Party, there is a group of people who want to get back to legislating on the NHS inside the UK because they live for the hope that they will become one day a governing party and they can reverse some of the changes that have been made in health service, a view which I totally and utterly share. Now, this doesn't, you don't ask to say whether you're in favour of a marketised health service or you want to go back to an Aaron Bevans health service. But it's very important for some Labour people to think that if they leave, this becomes an option. And I personally think there's no difficulty for somebody who wants sovereignty to return as of right to the British people in going on with that. And I think that's one of the ways you can get at Labour voters who want to leave, is to understand what a real threat their type of National Health Service is faced by the NHS being included at the moment in TTIP. Now, it's already been agreed that countries can opt their health services out. The British government are refusing to do it. If we were to win this referendum, automatically, then it would have to put that one back in. So that's a concrete policy both ways. A, spend more money on the NHS, and also do this whole thing. So do this arrangement with TT, put in an amendment. If you don't do it, and it becomes a treaty, you're finished. You can't amend a treaty. So and there are other areas where, and I think you've been very wise in the rejigging of the Leave campaign to give prominence to Gisela and to some other Labour people. But just remember, there's a long, long tradition of Labour centralists who are anti-federalist. I was a candidate in June 62, yes, I fought the 62, and I was a Gateskill supporter. I applauded when he made his speech, and I have always been against federalism. And that strand is a very serious strand in Labour Party thinking, and don't believe it is not dead. So how to winkle it out and to vote free in this next 100 days will be quite important. Quite important.
Thank you.
John.
Can I probe you a little further on what I think is a rather optimistic view you've expressed, that in the event of a Brexit vote, Cameron and Team Cameron will be absolutely accepted as the right people to then sit down and negotiate? I suspect the reason you said this is what you almost gave, because back in 1975, the British public were more or less ready, post a vote, whichever way it had gone, to leave it to Wilson and Callaghan and to be the accepted stewards of the next move. You and I, you may have forgotten this, shared a platform in 1975. I think our opposition was Alan Clark and John Aspinall. But at the end of it, that and many other audiences could all see that Callaghan and Wilson were a perfectly fair team to be handling what might have been the negative vote. Today, I sense that the British public, in particular the Conservative Party, just simply isn't ready to say, well, you said all these things in the referendum campaign, and now you've got to sort of more or less say the opposite. There's great trust in Cabinet government and Cameron government to do the right thing. Whether that's true or not, I just don't think the public are going to accept it.
Yeah. Firstly, it's not my job. And those of us who are in this campaign have not come in to get themselves lined up with internal disputes inside the Tory party. And I think it would be madness for us to go. I would also say something else. I don't think it's a good idea to get involved in it at all. We have scored, I think, very heavily about this imbalance of approach which the Prime Minister has indicated. I think he'll have to row back. And if he starts to row back, it's advantageous to it. If he continues to push forward, well, then he will live with the consequences. But it is not, in my view, a sensible thing for a campaign about the direction of travel of the country to get itself involved in who should or should not be the Prime Minister. As far as I'm concerned, he is the Prime Minister. I like the stability of going into a government that has got 4 years before an election to handle this transition period, and I think we're all much better in the campaign to stay out of this subject and leave that for the Conservative Party when they have to come together, and they will have to, tend to the bruises and everything like that. As far as we're concerned, the country's best interests are having a Conservative cabinet that can meet and can handle the issue in a united way, whatever the result.
Please.
What's your opinion on, if Britain was to leave the European Union, on Britain's relationships with emerging markets, predominantly China, India and Turkey?
Well, I've not dealt with China in my business life, but I've dealt quite a bit with Africa and Russia. For the last 21 years I've been in business, not in politics. I'm convinced that Britain can do a lot more in emerging markets. And some of the people that I'm working with in this campaign, you know, they're seeing opportunities in Cuba. They're seeing opportunities in many different parts of the world. And I think we have always been international world traders. I come from the West Country, I'm Welsh really, and I mean, my grandfather was in the Merchant Navy, and we forget where we were. Liverpool, I know very well now, having been Chancellor at University for 14 years. I was just there for the Everton match on Saturday. I mean, that is exporting more than even in the old glory days. You don't notice it because it's all containers. I believe that these are ports. I think we're going to have to, I hope we're going to hear much more about this ports bill, which the EU is putting through, which I think Daniel Hanna is very much keen on, which is an absolute classic example of the EU being dominated by Amsterdam and Rotterdam and putting in an internal market, some of you may notice of this, which I think is an absurdity in the health service, and it's even more an absurdity in these small ports, and telling them they have to go out to tender, compulsory tender, to dredge, when one family, in the case of Plymouth, has been dredging our routes out from Sutton Harbour for decades, and everybody's satisfied. Why the hell should they go through some tendering arrangement? These small ports are looking after us and have done, and I think we should get a great energy. I want to hear from Owen Patterson, what are we going to do about fishing? I thought the fishing thing was an absolute bloody disgrace. On the day before we went into the negotiations, they produced this common fishing policy. So I think there are huge opportunities, and I want this campaign to be positive and going out each day, each week, with policies which will happen once we've chosen this change of direction. And I think we should be very much open to it. And so when the scientists get on their high horse, we should have been quicker. We should have said, we want to invest in science. That's also one of the places we want to put some of the budget money. So the priorities that are really the campaign have chosen the right ones. And for 2 or 3 days we allowed them to dominate, and then we did have a scientist speaking alternatively. So we've got to follow and stop these canards that are running. There are a hell of a lot of them at the moment, and we need to knock them down. We need to be confident. I don't think we should get too much personalised into slicing into people's reputations and everything like that. Leave that alone. These are serious issues. It's a great choice for the country. But if we go out, we need to go out with elan and confidence. It's no good going out with a tail between our legs. And therefore, the quality of the cabinet and the nature of the negotiations, we are entitled, having chosen the course of direction, to believe that the government will reflect that choice. So it will be a changed team. You know, maybe the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer says the same, but we need to have the feeling that there are going to be some people in some of the other key posts which will reflect the people's choice. And I hope the Cabinet Secretary will also be listening a little bit more than he has been up until now about the nature of a referendum. You take away an MP's rights when you go for a referendum. These poor blighters are forced to vote whatever they may think. They have to put through this legislation. And it's very important that there's a level playing field and a fair democratic election without intervention from President Obama.
Michael is going to ask the last question before mine.
David, very interesting. Can I ask you, going back to 1975, what's your sense of the campaign and the forces on both sides in the campaign now compared to 1975? Because I made a number of films at the time, and at that time, the No campaign had only 3 organs that were on their side. And that was the Morning Star, the Spectator, and the Dundee Courier. So that was one of the major changes, but there are many others.
I think having a substantial portion of the press behind you does help on this confidence issue. And I think that it must have been a big shock to the Prime Minister to get the thumbs down for his negotiations. We all know what happens. You get into these negotiations, you get in part of it all, they're all friends, you know, you believe it yourself, you know. We've all done it. I mean, it's very, very easy. But then when it comes back, it sometimes comes as a very rude shock. it has had a comprehensive, and we're not really discussing it now, we're going to the big issue. The big issue is the choice of direction. We've been offered a chance to come back from where we were. I mean, we can all argue about consistency and everything like that. I do believe that the failure of the Eurozone, we wouldn't be here if the Eurozone had been a success, let's face it. But it is fatally flawed, that Eurozone. And they will not change it. I was in Berlin with David Marsh, who wrote the book on the Euro, and saw everybody who was involved in the Euro. And I think we both came away with the feeling there will be no changes before 2023. Very likely not before 2025, and you can't even say to yourself that they are going to grapple it beyond 2025. So we're saddled with this thing for quite a long time. And the answer, Mr. Obama, what would we do? Is he asking us to stay until it breaks, until it collapses? I think that's what he really is asking, and that is no doubt in the interests of Wall Street. But if we do that, the disruption, the difficulties that we now talk about with an agreed transition period, there'll be nothing to transition out of. If the Eurozone collapses, the EU collapses. There'll be under no illusion about that. It will be, I mean, it may call itself still the EU, but in all respects it will be a disaster. I think we have a straight choice. After all, what does Mervyn King say? He says this will go on, this Eurozone crisis. I trust his judgment. He's behaved a good deal better than most. And I think that Alchemy is a very good title for a book about it too. And I think that this is the choice. We have the chance, and we should say this more to the British people, we have a chance of an orderly transition out of this now. And you're being offered the choice. Wait until the Eurozone collapses, and you just see what's going to hit you. It will be very nasty indeed. If we can get out before it, we'll have served the interests of this country very well indeed.
Well done, David. I know there were lots of people who wanted to ask questions. I'm sorry there isn't time. I've got to let our guest of honour go. But thank you all very much for being here. It's wonderful that you're all here. And please do come and buy this great pamphlet. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I blocked your view. I didn't realise.